Hello, welcome to this asynchronous resource, which is an online version of the Dissertation Writers Workshop that we run in the Writing Hub, part of the Teaching and Learning Commons at UCSD. This asynchronous resource is broken into 4 parts, and between these 4 parts and the companion worksheet, we believe this is an equivalent alternative to participating in the in-person dissertation writing workshop. So there are 4 videos in this resource. Each video will overview different aspects of what we cover in the Dissertation Writers Workshop. In addition, there is a companion worksheet that you can use alongside your work with these videos. So as you watch the videos, there will be moments to pause and engage with the companion worksheet. And in this worksheet, you'll find guided exercises and opportunities to explore and to dig deeper into the topics that we talk about in that part of the resource. We do recommend you engage with this worksheet, but remember, it's just for you, so you don't need to stress about it. Use the worksheet to the extent that it is helpful for you and it helps you guide you in your thinking and guide you in your exploration. But remember that you can make the worksheet your own, and you don't need to worry about what you write in it because no one has to see it except for you. I also want to start with a quick disclaimer that everyone's dissertation is different, and what happens in your dissertation is also really contextual based on the relationship you have with your advisor, your department's requirements, your disciplinary requirements, and your disciplinary expectation. And all of that creates multiple kinds of dissertations and multiple kinds of requirements that students have to navigate when writing a dissertation. This workshop will not be able to address your specific concerns about your dissertation relative to your advisor, department, or discipline. But instead, this resource will offer a generalist perspective. We'll keep our focus on the dissertation as a genre of academic writing and as a kind of writing exercise that students do in education programs, i.e. doctoral education programs. We'll keep our focus there, but even though we have a generalist perspective, we still believe that that kind of perspective can be helpful in helping you navigate through the more particular peculiarities of your particular department and discipline. I also want to add a quick disclaimer that in this asynchronous version of the Dissertation Writers Workshop, we don't have much community in this format, but that's okay. In the in-person dissertation workshop, we have time for structured writing, and that is similar to what we do in our writing retreats. So you can use this asynchronous resource as a way to get the information about the dissertation, and then you can access other Writing Hub services that will help you get community in the writing process. So I do recommend you join a writing retreat or you join the writing room, which happens every weekday morning. Okay, with that, let's get started. So this part of the resource is part 1, and we're going to explore the genre, audience, and purpose of a dissertation. We're ultimately asking in this part of the resource, what is a dissertation? And part of what makes this question hard to answer is that our senior peers, those who have gone before us and have written and defended their dissertations, leave after they're finished. And so oftentimes when we're working on dissertations, we are working on peers, i.e. other folks who are writing their dissertations as well, or we're working with senior peers, our faculty and advisors who wrote their dissertation years ago, perhaps many years ago. And so our near peers, those who are senior peers, are close peers to us who have gone through the process, but they're still relatively close to the process. After they defend their dissertation, we leave. That's what grad school is all about. And so what makes this hard to answer is actually a feature of the fact that most people don't have access to peers that they can talk to about the dissertation writing process. They don't have a dissertation older sibling, if you will, who can help them navigate it from a more peer-like perspective. So that's what this resource is aimed to help you do. It's aimed to give you a sort of peer-to-peer idea of what a dissertation is and how you can navigate it successfully. Before we begin, I think it's important to start with a reflection. So at this point, I'll ask you to pause this video and pull up the companion worksheet and start with these reflection questions. What is motivating you to engage in this resource about the dissertation? What are 2 or 3 words that you would use to describe your relationship to your dissertation, and why those words? I think it's important to start with this kind of reflection before we get going, because believe it or not, how you're feeling about your dissertation and how you're feeling about your dissertation progress is influencing how you're going about working on it. It's influencing the words that you choose and the way that you're structuring your argument in the prose, but it's also influencing how often you engage with your dissertation, how likely you are to sit with your dissertation for a few hours a day, and all of that is influencing your dissertation progress. So it's worth taking a moment just to pause and think about how you're feeling with regards to the dissertation, why you're motivated to engage in this, because that will show up for you in your writing process. So pause the video now, pull up the companion worksheet, and start with this reflection. Okay, hopefully you've had time to work on the reflection questions to start us out. So now I'll talk through the first part of this resource. What is a dissertation? First of all, I want to say that dissertations are confusing for everyone. It is not just you. Dissertations are very complicated genres, and they are confusing for every single person who's ever written a dissertation. You are not alone. One reason why dissertations are confusing is that these are unfamiliar genres. You don't have practice writing or even reading in this genre. So for example, how many dissertations have you read in whole, from start to finish, introduction through conclusion? 1, 2, 3? I doubt you've read more than 5. But if I asked you the same question, how many research articles or journal articles have you read from introduction to conclusion? I bet there's a lot more. 5, 10, 50? You've probably read a lot more in that genre. And so you're much more familiar with writing a paper or a journal article than you are with writing a dissertation, because you haven't had a lot of familiarity or practice reading or writing in this genre. You do, however, have some familiarity with the pieces because you've been working on research papers and publications and proposals throughout your time in grad school. You have some familiarity with what goes into a literature review or a description of a research project. But how those pieces come together to form a dissertation, a capital D dissertation, is something you don't have a lot of familiarity with. And that's okay. You can leverage your knowledge about how to work with those pieces, and this resource is meant to bridge the gap to help you see how that all combines into one document, one genre. Another reason why dissertations are confusing is that they're one time only. This is probably your first and only time working in this genre, unless you want to go and get a second, third, or fourth PhD, in which case, great, you'll write multiple dissertations. But for most of us, we've never written a dissertation before, and we will never write a dissertation again. And then finally, something that makes dissertations confusing and difficult is that even though they're only one time, and even though they're really unfamiliar to most of us who start writing them, they are very high stakes. You've been in graduate school for years, and this is the thing that is standing between you and having your PhD or your doctorate degree. And that is a really high stakes writing situation, and it takes a long time to write a dissertation. So because this is a kind of culmination of your work in grad school, that just adds to the complexity, and it just adds to the noise that is already happening in the dissertation as a writing project. So consider this quote. The dissertation is a genre on the border between overlapping sequential activities. On one hand, it is the ultimate student paper, the final school-based display of knowledge and ability. On the other hand, it is often in whole or in part the first significant contribution to a disciplinary conversation. In the language of genre, dissertations are multi-genres, responding to multiple exigencies, functioning in multiple rhetorical situations, and addressing multiple readers. So this dynamic, this balance between the ultimate student paper and the first significant contribution to a disciplinary conversation, this is going to be the basis of our workshop here, or this video today. because dissertations are confusing partly because they are multi-genre. They're not just a student paper, and they're not just a disciplinary conversation contribution. They're both, and they have to function in both of those ways. And why is this? Why is this the case? Well, Anthony Parr actually gives it to us in the first sentence of this quote. There's a structural reason why dissertations are confusing. The dissertation is a genre that sits on the border between overlapping but sequential activities. And those activities are the student self that you've been cultivating throughout your time in grad school, as well as your professional self that you've been cultivating throughout your time in grad school. Consider where the dissertation falls in the structure of graduate education. You start grad school and you're taking courses and working really closely with faculty in a student-like manner. As you go through grad school, you get increasingly independent, or at least interdependent with other students in your lab or in your department. But you have to take on more responsibility, and you become more independent as a young professional in your discipline. Then, after you advance to candidacy, you engage in independent research based on a proposal that you wrote yourself. And the dissertation is this culminating genre that shows your professional contribution with that research. So you have been engaged throughout graduate school in a long process of professionalization, but you also at the same time have had a student identity in that process of professionalization. The dissertation is this genre that sits right on that line, where your student self ends and your professional self takes over. That's where the dissertation is. It responds to both of those things. And so because the dissertation is structurally on the border between these overlapping and sequential activities, that is the overlap between your studentness and your professionalness. Because it sits right there on that overlap, dissertations as a genre of writing are very liminal. That means they're just in between. They're in between these two different things, and they become their own thing in between. And that's what makes dissertations multi-genre. They have to respond to the student side of graduate school. You have to show that you have achieved the learning purposes of this educational program. But they also have to respond to the professionalization side of grad school. They have to show that you are ready to be an independent member, professional member of your discipline. And that's what makes dissertations confusing, is they're liminal. They sit right in between those two spaces. In most of the time, when we're working on a piece of writing, we are generally thinking about these three things, even if we don't realize it. In most of our writing experiences to date, we've been writing for a particular audience, for a particular purpose, in a particular genre. So we are navigating genre, audience, and purpose when we're writing articles or book reviews or conference presentations or things like that. Those are particular genres with a clear purpose and an understandable audience. But when switching over to thinking about a dissertation, again, because the dissertation sits at that in-between, we're actually talking about these things in different dimensions. So we're not just talking about one genre, we're talking about two, both a professional research contribution as well as a student paper. We're not just talking about one purpose, we're talking about two. And we're not just talking about one audience, we're talking about audiences. I'll talk more about purposes and audiences in just a moment. But the key thing to remember with this slide is that navigating the different things that the dissertation has to do for whom and for what purposes can be tricky. And that is not because you don't have what it takes to write a dissertation. That's because the dissertation itself is a strange genre situated in a strange moment at the end of the graduate school journey. So the complication is coming from the genre and the structure in which the genre happens. It's not coming from inside of you, and it has nothing to do with your ability or inadequacies. All of that is just internalization. And you can leave that here. You can shed that right now, because I'm here to tell you that dissertations themselves are strange, and it's perfectly natural for you to be having difficulty navigating this multi-dimensional rhetorical situation. So Dissertations are required because they fulfill two distinct purposes, not one purpose, but two. So on the one hand, the purpose that a dissertation fulfills is assessment of student work. In a dissertation, you're trying to show that you've done sufficient work to meet the degree requirements of your program. You're also trying to show that you can talk and write about your work in the language of your field. On some level, every graduate program is meant to introduce us to the language of our field so that we can have conversations with other people in our discipline. And so what you're doing in a dissertation is expressing that language. You're talking in and through that language to show that you have the language, to show that you have some fluency and some capability to use that language and have conversations with other people in your field. And finally, this is about ultimately demonstrating that you can be a steward of the discipline. This is part of the hidden curriculum of almost every graduate program. Almost every graduate program is not just trying to produce people with degrees in that subject, they are also trying to produce people who identify with that discipline, who believe in the usefulness of that discipline, who feel motivated and inspired by it, and who want to carry forth that discipline and its ways of thinking and ways of doing in the world in the future. And so this is part of what it means to be a student in a graduate program, in a doctoral program in particular, that you are becoming a steward of the discipline. And part of what you're trying to show in this student paper is that you have that stewardship, that you understand what it means to study in this field, you understand what it means to be called a member of this field, and you can be trusted with that information and with that responsibility. On the other side of the coin, because remember, dissertations have two purposes, not just one. On the other side of the coin, the purpose of the dissertation is to show that you can participate in the professional research culture of your discipline. And so if we think that disciplines aren't just ways of organizing information, they are cultures. They are research cultures where there are conventions and traditions about what counts as knowledge, what is useful knowledge, how knowledge is discovered or understood, and how knowledge is communicated. These are cultural ideas. So what you're doing in a dissertation, very similar to showing that you can be a steward of the discipline, you're showing that you can participate in that culture. And by that, I mean that you're showing that you have read and understood the work of other scholars or other researchers in your field, and that you bring that work into your own work, that reading those things has also influenced your thinking and your research design and what you see in your data. That's part of participation. If participation means a sort of collective participation, that I understand you and what you're doing and I respond to that with what I'm doing, that's participatory. And so your dissertation is also showing a kind of participatory engagement in the professional research culture of your field. And to do that, you're showing, and by doing that, you show that you can have a productive conversation with other professionals in your discipline, that you can engage in the work of what other people are doing, you can be informed by that work, you can respond to that work with work of your own, and in that you're having a conversation. So again, this is about participatory engagement. So these are the two purposes of a dissertation, and those dual purposes of the dissertation then inform the genre. And by genre, I just mean what it looks like, what happens with it. And so again, on one hand, the dissertation is the ultimate student paper. That means it is constrained by certain requirements and authority expectations. So your advisor, your department, and your division and the university all have particular requirements for what the dissertation has to look like and what it has to be like. That's because that's a student paper. That's because they want to constrain how the information is presented or how the information is packaged, because this is a student assignment, essentially. And so the fact that the dissertation has to be read and approved by someone in authority, that activates often your student self. So the part of yourself that has been a successful student to date, otherwise you wouldn't be here, that gets activated when you think about the dissertation, because you know someone with authority has to read it and give it the stamp of approval. So you want to prove that you've done enough work, that you've done enough good work. You want to prove, give me the degree, I've earned it. Yes, give me the A, give me the stamp, I'm ready. And in that, you're navigating a need for the authority figures in your research life and in your academic life to approve of the document and then later to approve of the defense. But remember that there's another side to this as well. And so in the dissertation, you as a writer are also trying to navigate how you want to create and offer an independent professional contribution. So there's an expectation, not just that your dissertation conforms to the requirements, but also that it can stand alone, that after you defend your dissertation and after you move on from grad school, that your dissertation can go into ProQuest or some other repository of dissertations, and it can live there, and it can speak for you as a professional in this field, or at least where you were at the time that you were writing your dissertation as a professional in this field. And that, of course, is going to activate your professional self. So instead of worrying only about what authority figures are going to think about this dissertation, about this document, you're also thinking about what you think about it. This needs to be good enough for you. It needs to pass your standards because it speaks for you. It is a contribution made by you to your discipline. And so you, of course, want it to be good. Sometimes you want it to be perfect, which is impossible. But you do, of course, have a desire to showcase your passion, your competencies in your discipline, and your skills for research and writing. And so it's very natural when working in a dissertation to feel pulled in both of these directions. On the one hand, to say, oh, it just needs to be good enough to pass. But on the other hand, it still needs to be good. I still need to be proud of it. So oftentimes you'll hear people say that the best dissertation is a done dissertation. And that's true. Except what that is leaning on is that the dissertation that is done can be the ultimate student paper and still be good as long as it speaks for you and as long as you're happy with it. So I'm going to pause just for a moment and remind you that it's not either or. You don't have to choose between which of these genres you're actually writing in. You can't choose between these things. Even if you say, okay, I'm just going to write the ultimate student paper, that's fine. You will still find yourself making an independent professional contribution because that's the purpose of this genre, one of the purposes of this genre. And because of that, you can't escape that part of this genre or these genres. You can't escape that. So likewise, you might only want to be thinking about yourself and the professional contribution you want to make. But again, you can't escape the ultimate student paper-ness of the dissertation because that's what it is and that's part of what the purpose is. So it's not either or, it's both and. It is both an ultimate student paper written for the purpose of assessment to show that you've done sufficient scholarly work to meet your degree requirements. It is also an independent professional contribution that shows that you can confidently converse with other scholars in your field and discipline. Okay, so we've talked about genre, we talked about audience, we talked about genre and purpose. Now, who are our audiences? Who are we actually writing dissertations for? You only have one audience for the dissertation, but that one audience is assuming a kind of double vision or a double mindset. Your actual audience is your dissertation chair or your advisor, perhaps your co-chair if you have, or co-chairs if you have co-chairs, as well as your committee. And that's all. And you might think, no, I'm writing a dissertation that I'm going to publish. I'm going to turn my dissertation into papers, or I'm writing a dissertation based on papers I've already published. And that's great if that's the case for you. However, the papers that you have already published or the papers that you intend to publish after your dissertation will not be the same thing that goes into the dissertation. Again, because the dissertation is a different genre that has to have that student feel, that student paperness. And so if you talk to assistant professors who are publishing from their dissertation, almost every assistant professor will tell you that a substantial amount of rewriting is involved to take what they wrote in their dissertation and turn it into publications for new genres and new audiences. That's because the new genre, the new audience, that dictates what the thing has to look like and what it has to do, and that's going to change the document. So even if you're taking your dissertation and turning it into a book, your dissertation is going to look and feel different than a book written for an academic publisher that needs to be marketed to different kinds of audiences, versus a dissertation that's being written for authority figures who are assuming the mindset of other people in your field. So remember that for this document, you have an actual audience of the people in the room reading the dissertation, and that's all. Once you start writing and publishing from the dissertation, you'll have new audiences, but also you'll have new genres to work in, and so the document itself will change. But that actual audience, when they're reading your dissertation and when they're in your dissertation defense, they take on the mindset of your implied audience. Your implied audience are experts in your subfield, or more broadly, other scholars in your discipline. Sometimes, depending on your discipline or your field of study, the implied audience might also be people in industry or policymakers or practitioners. So for example, if you're in the field of education, the implied audience might also be other educators or education leaders. And so it's important to remember that your actual audience, those 5 people in the room, maybe 6, will assume the mindset of the implied audience when they are reading your dissertation. And they do that so that they can determine if the dissertation achieves its purpose of being a professional contribution. So your actual audience is assessing the studentness. Does it pass? Does it meet the degree requirements? Do we give it the stamp? Do we sign the paper? But because they're also adopting the mindset of the implied audience, they're also assessing whether or not the dissertation achieves that other purpose. Does this act as a contribution? Does this engage the work of other people in the field? And would other people in the field accept this work as a contribution to our research culture? So your audience is taking on both of these perspectives at the same time. And if you're ever feeling stuck in your dissertation because you're worried that the expert in your field might read your dissertation and might have critiques about it, don't let that implied audience get into your head. It's really unlikely that experts in your field are going to read your dissertation. They'll read the things that you publish from your dissertation or the publications that you wrote that went into your dissertation. But at the end of the day, your dissertation is most likely to be read by 5 people, plus other folks who might find it on ProQuest who are interested in reading dissertations. And if this is feeling a little strange or weird to hear, remember that your dissertation still has tremendous value. It has tremendous value for the people in your field. It has tremendous value for you right now, as well as for you in your future. And it will have value for people who read it. And there are people who read dissertations. It's just not the people that you're probably worried about when you're in your head thinking about your audience. So what does all of this mean? What are the takeaways? First of all, I want you to remember that you are navigating a very complex rhetorical situation for the first time and probably the only time. You have some practice with the pieces, but not with the whole. So you have some practice with literature reviews and proposing research and talking about your methods, and perhaps even talking about findings or what you can argue from data. But how you put all of that together into a huge document with multiple chapters that's achieving both of these different purposes for both of these different, or in activating each of these different genres, that's tricky, and you've never done that before. This is a complex rhetorical situation that's also unfamiliar to you. I also want to remind you that your advisor has a different relationship to the dissertation than you do. First of all, your advisor has a lot more practice with this genre. If I asked your advisor how many dissertations they've read from intro to conclusion, 1, 3, 5, I bet that they will have read a lot because they've served on multiple committees most likely. So they have more practice with this genre. So they have more implied or taken for granted knowledge about what dissertations entail, what they should look like. To the extent possible, you should try to access that tacit or taken for granted knowledge that your advisor has by virtue of the fact that they just have more exposure to the dissertation genre. At the same time, your advisor has a different relationship to this than you do because they're engaging with it from a different kind of audience and purpose position. Remember that they are your actual audience, but they're assuming that double mindset. They're thinking for themselves as your advisor, but they're also trying to think for other people in your discipline, and they're trying to act as a stand-in for the broader discipline in your field. And they also have a different understanding of the purpose. They are the ones who have to both approve of the dissertation as a student paper, but they're also trying to assess whether or not it achieves its purpose of a professional contribution as well. So they're in a kind of double mindset, a double space. And sometimes when they're giving feedback, it will be hard to navigate if they're giving you that feedback as an advisor who has to sign it and give it a stamp, or if they're giving you that feedback as a professional mentor who's thinking about the broader contribution you can make. And when working with your advisor in your dissertation, try to navigate those two sides explicitly and try to make that explicit in your conversation. Because of all of this practice and this different relationship with the dissertation, your advisor has a lot of internalized understandings of what the dissertation can do and be. And as I mentioned before, you should try to make those internalized, implicit things as explicit as you can when having conversations with your advisor about your dissertation. You also likely have a lot of expertise and information to work with your research. That means you have some decisions to make. You've been in grad school for a long time now, and it probably feels like even longer than it's been. And so you have a lot of expertise rolling around in your head. You have a lot of information from your research that you could potentially work with, but not all of that could possibly make it into a dissertation. If it did, it would be a 1,000-page dissertation and it would take you way too long to write it. And so that means you're going to have to make decisions about what gets included and what doesn't. And when you're navigating those decisions, remember that this has to pass. And so you have to think about what is or isn't essential. And you can think about what's essential for your student self versus what's essential for your professional self. Just as I mentioned, you should navigate the difference between student and professional with your advisor. You should navigate that internally as well. So when you're making choices about whether or not to include something in your dissertation, or whether or not you want to explore a particular detail or finding or idea from your research topic, ask yourself if it's essential. Ask yourself if it's essential for the student paper to succeed. And also ask yourself if it's important for the professional contribution to be able to stand alone. Is that detail, is that route of information going to be essential for your student self or your professional self, for one but not the other? And just try to navigate that when you're thinking about making decisions about what to include in the dissertation or not. The good news to all of this is that it's not just you. It has never been just you who is confused by dissertations. Everyone who's ever written a dissertation has been confused by it because dissertations themselves are confusing. The other piece of good news is that there is a way through it and you absolutely can do it. The future videos in this resource, part 2, 3, and 4, are meant to help you get there. If you find yourself getting stuck in your dissertation, try to go back to the basics. Try to remember your actual audience, your chair, maybe your co-chairs, and 4 others. And ask yourself, what do these human beings need to see from me? What do these people need to see in this text in order to achieve the assessment purpose of the dissertation? So if you're feeling stuck, you can ask yourself, how do I show the work that I've done and what I've learned? And remember that what you're ultimately trying to do, at least part of what you're ultimately trying to do, is just show that you've done sufficient work to qualify for the doctoral degree. And that's it. It's okay to start out thinking about this, or it's okay to use this student paper idea as a way to get you through a writing block. It won't stay that way. It will change as you work on a dissertation and feel more motivated toward it again. But when you're feeling stuck, it's okay to default back to this student paper idea that this just needs to pass. And so when you think that, you can ultimately lower the stakes for yourself and ask yourself, how can I lower the stakes for myself or lower the stakes for this dissertation so that I can get back to working on it? Remember that this is probably a temporary state. As you work on your dissertation and as you realize the kinds of arguments you're making, as you start leveraging different pieces of information and different ideas that have been percolating in your mind for a long time, you will get excited. You'll feel interested. The curiosity that moved you toward this program and toward this research will show itself again. But it's okay initially, especially if you're feeling stuck. Just go back to the student paper. Just go back to the student paper that's written for your actual audience and let that be enough to get you going. I promise it will be temporary. All right, here is your ultimate guide to what your dissertation is and what your dissertation isn't. Your dissertation is a demonstration of your scholarly work and your ability to meaningfully situate that work within your research culture. So that means you're showing what you've done, but also that you've read the work of other people in your research culture and you can situate your own work within that broader research environment. Here's what your dissertation isn't. It is not a cumulative reflection of all your capabilities. Those could not fit into a single document. You would need an entire library to showcase and to have all of your capabilities. Not just because you've been in grad school for a long time, not just because you're incredibly smart and bright and talented, but because you've also lived a full life. You have a lot of capabilities and your dissertation couldn't even begin to scratch the surface of that. The dissertation is just one project. It's not going to show everything you can do in research or otherwise. Similarly, your dissertation will not be a thorough documentation of all your research findings. There are going to be lots of things left on the cutting room floor. And so for your dissertation project, you engaged in a complex research project. I know that because if you advanced to candidacy, you had to write a research proposal, and that research proposal probably had a lot of moving parts. Dissertation level research is highly complex research. You gather a lot of information and a lot of data, and you have a lot of potential directions to go in when you're talking about what you found from that project. And not all of that will be able to fit into a dissertation. It just can't. So there's going to be things left on the cutting room floor, and that's okay. You don't have to discard those things, and those things were not a waste of your time. You can use them later in future research projects, or you can integrate them in a way that you didn't foresee in a different way into your dissertation, even if you're not showcasing them. So for an example from my own dissertation, I studied veterans in the United States, and in particular, veteran-focused charity organizations. And something I found in my research was something having to do with political conservatism in that sector of nonprofits. And I thought that was fascinating, but it didn't fit into my dissertation anywhere. And so I didn't include it. Does that mean I can't use it later? No. And in fact, I'm still thinking those thoughts quite often, and I'm still trying to pursue additional research in that area. But it didn't go in the dissertation, and that's okay, because the dissertation can't be a thorough documentation of all the research findings. Your dissertation is not the culmination of your research life. You will keep learning and researching when this is over. No matter what you do after grad school, your research life never ends because your research, yourself as a researcher has grown over time. In grad school, you become a researcher. You have a researcher's mindset. And so your research life is not culminating in the dissertation. The dissertation is just one thing that one culmination of a particular moment in your research life. And that's it. There will be more later, I promise. Similarly, the dissertation is not the thing that will get you tenure. See above. You keep learning and researching when this is over. So even if you intend to go on the tenure track, even if you intend to publish from your dissertation, you're not necessarily going to publish directly word for word from your dissertation. Your dissertation is going to be a point from which you jump off, a starting point from which you go down new roads and take new routes. You might even need additional research and additional data in order to publish from your dissertation. And that's what's going to get you to tenure, not the dissertation. The dissertation is going to get you out of grad school. What you do after the dissertation, that's what gets you to tenure. Okay, so we're now at the end of the part 1 video. And at this point, I'd like to ask you to go back to the companion worksheet and to engage in a few more reflection questions. The first is to revisit those 2 to 3 words that you wrote down at the beginning of this resource. And then to think, how do you feel now? Are there a different set of words that you could use to describe your relationship or your feelings about the dissertation? Think about what could be a helpful way for you to think about the dissertation. Do you want to think about it as a student paper, a professional contribution, or some combination of both, something in between? Think about if your dissertation only needed to be passable. How would that change your approach to working on your dissertation now? Remember, it is okay to think about your dissertation this way. It will evolve. As you get working on your dissertation, as it starts to become clearer what you want to argue and what you can do, your interest will go up, your motivation will go up, and you will no longer think about it as just something that needs to pass. Then finally, think about who can be your dissertation allies. We talked about the fact that your advisor is going to have a very different relationship to the dissertation than you will, and that's good, that's okay. But similarly, you can have dissertation allies who also have different relationships to your dissertation than you do. Your dissertation ally can be with anyone with whom you have a relationship who wants to and can support you in the process of getting it done. That can include your friends, your graduate student peers, people in your cohort if you have close relationships with them, but it can also include your friends outside of grad school, your family, your community. And so you can engage lots of different people as allies in the dissertation process, and you should. So think about who those dissertation allies could be and how they might support you in the process. So this is the end of the this is the end of part 1 of the resource. Engage in those reflection questions, and when you're ready, move on to part 2.